Open your kitchen right now. Pull out anything with a label. The bread, the yogurt, the pasta sauce, the peanut butter, the salad dressing, almost all of it has sugar in it. Not because it needs to, because someone, somewhere figured out that you can't stop eating it once it's there. You think you have a choice. You don't. Your body was hijacked 10,000 years ago, and the trap has been getting tighter ever since. This is the entire history of sugar. And by the end, you'll understand why the sweetest thing you eat today is the result of empires, slavery, addiction science, and one of the most successful manipulations of the human body in history. It starts in New Guinea. About 10,000 years ago, a tall, woody grass grew wild in the swamps there. The locals discovered that if you snapped a stalk open and chewed it, your mouth filled with something sweet. That grass was sugar cane, and for thousands of years, that's all sugar was. A wild plant, a small luxury, something you bit into and threw away. Then it traveled, slowly, across the islands of Southeast Asia, into India, and somewhere in India, around 500 BC, someone figured out something that would change the world. If you boiled the juice of the cane long enough, you could turn it into solid crystals, storable, tradable, portable. This was the first sugar. The Sanskrit word for it was shakara, which is where we get the modern word sugar, and it spread along trade routes the way fire spreads along dry grass. By the time it reached the Mediterranean, sugar was something almost mythical. The Greeks called it the honey that needs no bees. It was so rare that Roman doctors prescribed it as medicine by the gram for sick patients only. If you held a small lump of sugar in the year 1100 in Europe, you were holding something more valuable per ounce than silver. Kings gave it as gifts to other kings. It appeared at royal banquets sculpted into the shapes of swans and castles to impress visiting nobles. For most of human history, sugar was not food. It was a status symbol, a possession, something you owned, not something you ate. And then the world figured out how to break that limit, and the cost was almost unimaginable. In the 1400s, Portuguese sailors started exploring the Atlantic. They found islands off the coast of Africa that had the perfect climate for sugarcane: hot, wet, fertile. The problem was that growing sugarcane is brutal work. The stalks are sharp, the fields are unbearable in the heat. The cane has to be cut, crushed, and boiled within hours of harvest or it spoils. It is some of the hardest agricultural labor a human body can perform. So the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, and then the British and the French came up with a solution that would define the next 400 years of human history. They captured human beings from Africa and forced them to do the work. The numbers are difficult to hold in your head. Over the next 4 centuries, more than 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic in chains. The majority of them ended up on sugar plantations. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, in the American South, sugar plantations had the highest death rates of any work in the colonial world. The average life expectancy of an enslaved sugar worker in some Caribbean colonies was around 7 years after arrival. Every spoonful of sweetness flowing into Europe in the 1700s carried that weight. The British alone went from consuming about 4 pounds of sugar per person per year in 1700 to over 18 pounds by 1800. By 1900, it was around 90 pounds per person. That spike was not natural, it was engineered. Sugar got cheap because human suffering made it cheap, and the cheaper it got, the more it spread into tea, into bread, into chocolate, into rum, which the empires then sold back to West Africa in exchange for more enslaved people. The triangular trade, sugar, slaves, rum, a loop of profit built on a single sweet crystal. By the mid-1800s, sugar was no longer a luxury, it was infrastructure. Working-class British families were drinking tea with multiple spoonfuls of sugar at every meal because the calories were cheap and the energy was instant. Sugar had transformed from a status symbol into the fuel of empire, and the body of the modern human was about to start changing because of it. Then came the next leap, the factory. In the 1800s, industrial machinery made sugar production thousands of times more efficient. Then a German chemist figured out how to extract sugar from beets, which grow in colder climates. Suddenly, Europe could make its own sugar, year-round, without needing tropical plantations at all. Prices collapsed. Sugar went from expensive to nearly free. and the food industry was waiting. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, factories started inventing entirely new categories of food built around sugar: soft drinks, breakfast cereals, candy bars, condensed milk, mass-produced cookies. None of these things had really existed before. They were not adaptations of older foods. They were invented from scratch, designed to deliver sugar in the most addictive form possible. Coca-Cola was invented in 1886. By 1900, it was being sold in nearly every state in America. A single bottle contained 9 teaspoons of sugar. By the 1950s, kids across the Western world were starting their day with a bowl of Frosted Flakes, drinking Coke at lunch, and finishing dinner with ice cream. Annual sugar consumption in the United States had climbed past 100 pounds per person. For the first time in human history, the average person was consuming more sugar in 1 week than their medieval ancestor would have eaten in a lifetime. And then came the move that locked the trap shut. In 1957, a researcher figured out how to convert cornstarch into a syrup that was even sweeter than sugar and much cheaper to produce. They called it high fructose corn syrup. By the 1970s, American agricultural policy was producing so much corn that the government was actively pushing food companies to use HFCS in everything: soda, bread, ketchup, yogurt, crackers, frozen meals. If it had a label, it probably had high fructose corn syrup in it. Between 1970 and 2000, the average American's intake of added sugars rose by almost 25%. The food industry had figured out the thing that empires once needed slavery to do. They could make sugar essentially free, hide it inside any food, and make people consume it without ever realizing how much. And right around the same time, something started happening to human bodies that no doctor had ever seen at scale before. Obesity rates began climbing in the 1970s and never stopped. Type 2 diabetes, which used to be called adult-onset diabetes because children never got it, started appearing in children. Fatty liver disease, once almost exclusively caused by alcoholism, started showing up in people who had never had a drink in their lives. Doctors began seeing patterns of metabolic damage in young adults that used to appear only in the elderly. For decades, the food industry blamed fat. Fat was making you fat. That was the message in the 1980s and 1990s. Low fat became a moral category. Entire grocery aisles were redesigned around it. And what replaced the fat in those low-fat products? Sugar. To make low-fat food taste like anything at all, manufacturers added more sugar than the original version had ever contained. It is now clear from decades of research that this was the wrong target. The real driver of the modern metabolic crisis was not fat, it was sugar, hidden in nearly everything, eaten in quantities no human body was ever designed to handle. Your body evolved over 3 million years in a world where sugar was extremely rare. The only natural sources were ripe fruit and very occasionally wild honey. When your ancestors found these things, they ate as much as they could because the calories were precious and the next chance might be weeks away. Your body still runs that program. It cannot tell the difference between a wild fig in Africa 50,000 years ago and a can of soda in your fridge. The moment sugar hits your tongue, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical released by cocaine, the same chemical released by gambling, the same chemical that tells your brain do that again. Studies in rats have shown that when given a choice between cocaine and sugar water, the majority of the rats chose sugar. This is the trap, fully assembled. Your body wants sugar because sugar used to be rare and valuable. The food industry knows this and engineers products designed to trigger that response thousands of times more powerfully than nature ever could. And because sugar is hidden in nearly every processed food, you cannot avoid it without significant effort, even if you try. The result is the world you live in. Roughly 1 in 10 people on Earth now has diabetes. In some countries, it is closer to 1 in 5. Childhood obesity has more than tripled since the 1970s. Heart disease, the leading cause of death in most of the developed world, is closely linked to chronic high sugar consumption. The cost in human lives and suffering is now larger than the entire body count of every war fought in the 20th century combined. And here is the part that should make you pause. almost none of this is your fault. You did not invent the system that put sugar in your bread. You did not design the marketing that taught your children to crave bright colored cereals. You did not write the agricultural policy that made corn syrup cheaper than water. You inherited a food environment that was engineered over centuries to keep you eating one specific compound for as long as possible. The first humans who chewed sugarcane in New Guinea had no idea what they were starting. The traders who carried it across continents thought they were spreading a luxury. The empires that built plantations thought they were generating wealth. The factories that mass-produced it thought they were feeding the world. The food companies that hid it inside everything thought they were giving people what they wanted. And in a way, every single one of them was right. Sugar was a luxury, then it became a commodity, then it became infrastructure, then it became a weapon, even if nobody pointed it on purpose. What you eat today is the end of a 10,000-year story. The sweetness in your morning coffee was once worth more than silver. The granola bar in your bag is built on the corpses of millions of enslaved people. The soda in your fridge is the final form of a chemical relationship between sugarcane and the human brain that began before written language existed. You are not the consumer of this story. You are the destination. Every spoonful you swallow is the answer to a question that was asked in the New Guinea swamp 10,000 years ago. What if we could keep this feeling forever? The answer turned out to be yes. And the cost turned out to be everything. If you want more videos that unpack the systems quietly running your life, subscribe. There's a lot more buried in being human